We're talking about the justice imperative. I have two guests with me. There are people with first-hand information about the stigma attached to people who have served time in prison and the difficulty for them to rejoin our society in successful ways, to pick up their lives or to restart their lives and do so productively and positively and build families. And the reason that this doesn't happen more successfully is because there are lots of barriers in the system. We punish people by putting them in prison, then we keep punishing them after they have done their time. In other words, there's an extended serving of time because of all the barriers that we have in the system. So I'm going to have two people introduce themselves to you. Both of them are people who have served time in prison, and they are now rebuilding their lives. Michael, tell us your name and who you are.
My name is Michael Judd. I am a member of the Phoenix Association. I served 14 years, 8 months in prison. I currently work as a case manager.
You work as a case manager with an organization in Connecticut.
I do.
Okay, so I'm going to come back and ask you, what does a case manager do? All right? Kumar?
My name is Kumar Vishwanathan. I am the Director of Membership Development for the Phoenix Association. I also am formerly incarcerated and served approximately 23 years in the state prison. And now I'm here.
Okay. So the both of you wanted to do this piece specifically because you are concerned about what is happening to the lives of people who have served time in prison and who have been, who are committed to not going back to prison, to making a success of their lives, but find that there are many, many barriers in your way. So, Michael, why don't you tell us exactly what are your biggest concerns and what's been your experience?
There's so many factors that go into the struggle that of a person that is incarcerated, and I say that not because a person doesn't. The system is designed to deter crime, and but its effectiveness in the current system has been proven to be failing in certain areas. And some of those areas are providing effective treatment and interventions for people who are suffering from whether it be substance abuse, mental health, or circumstances in their lives that had driven them to criminal behavior. Personally, some of the most important barriers I would say are, especially for a person coming out of prison, would be have basic needs, obtaining housing, obtaining employment, simple things such as clothing and transportation that many of us take for granted are very difficult barriers for people.
Because let's put a pin in about transportation. When you come out of prison, you don't have a license, right? Or is your license suspended automatically when you go to prison?
Not always, but usually it's hard to renew the license. I mean, you can do that. Depending on how long you're incarcerated for, you can come home with a valid license. Unfortunately, many of the social connections to the community are severed during incarceration, and people coming home usually have a hard time finding employment, mostly based on the criminal record and the stigma and discrimination that's a result of that.
Okay. Kumar, now you were in for a long time. And I want to say, you were a student at UConn. You were a teenager, you were a student, you were in your second year when you got into trouble and ended up incarcerated. And you were incarcerated for a long time. So when you came out, you wouldn't have had a license because it would have expired. Right?
I hadn't even learned to drive
you
prior
hadn't
to
learned.
being incarcerated.
Okay. How difficult is it to learn to drive and get a license after having been incarcerated for a long time?
Learning to drive is still a process.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I still make mistakes, but I love it. It is really one of the great thrills of my life. But it took me a year in order to get my driver's license. Um, and getting around transportationally was very difficult.
Now, having been in prison, did that make it any more difficult for you to get a license?
It did. I couldn't do it while I was incarcerated.
Yeah, but when you came out, when you went to a driving school or whoever's going to teach you.
One of the things that is difficult is the prison ID is not sufficient for Department of Motor Vehicles, to use as a valid ID.
Oh, it's not?
It's not. They require a birth certificate, a passport, a social security card, something, very, very valid.
And how difficult is it to get those?
It's a process. It's a process. So it's not easy. And then, how do you get to DMV? Right, if you live in a place where there isn't transportation that's
yes.
already set up, I mean, there are many, many difficulties. How do you get the money in order to get the license? Right,
Now,
all those things.
Now we know that you were in college when you were first incarcerated. Did you have a high school education before?
I did.
Okay.
I went to trade school. I was a carpenter, so I was able to acquire employment
Okay.
soon after I got out of prison.
What was the biggest barriers you faced coming out of prison?
I'm one of the few who fortunately had some social connections, and I had family there to, supply. I had housing, but I think that for me, I would say the criminal history is probably one of the biggest obstacles. If a person can't find employment, if they reside on the outer fringes of society based on this the stigma behind being incarcerated, a person never feels fully integrated back into the community because they're forever being judged by actions that the choices that they had made, no matter how long ago. So I think it becomes it's a system that is designed to set a person up to fail. While incarcerated, there's not much integrity in the programming itself.
What do you mean? Not much integrity in the programming? What programming?
There's very little programming, many wait lists.
Oh, you mean in the prison
within
system?
the system itself. As we were discussing earlier off air, the amount of time spent in orientation units, you're spent 23 hours a day locked in a cell. 1 hour to come out, shower, use the phone, and recreation. And it could take up to almost a year before a person can get involved in a program. If you're serving...
So so let's say you're sentenced to 10 years. When you go into the prison and you have a 10-year sentence, what do they do with you what kind of programs are established in prison for you to go into to, say, learn a skill, or are you evaluated for mental health issues? I mean, what happens to you once you're in the system? What do you do on a day-to-day basis? Either of you can answer that.
Well, they have what they call an offender accountability plan now. This wasn't always part of the system, but they look at your, need scores, and all of these things are based on certain things they ascertain through any number of means. But what your drug score is, what your mental health score is, what your violence history is, and so they have scores, and then they, based off the scores, come up with things they feel will benefit you during the incarceration.
I want you to look into whichever camera is a red light, and I want you to tell people watching this segment, why do we need to reform our reentry programs to be more successful? Give me very, very succinctly 3 important things, and you do the same, Michael.
I think our reentry programs, some of them are good. They do not have nearly enough resources, and the support for those reentering men or women needs to be holistic and comprehensive. They need to be addressed in terms of work skills, in terms of employment, housing, mental health, because the PTSD and just being in prison for a long stretch can be tremendously difficult. They need social support from families, and they need organizations and state agencies that are supportive of their reentry, so that they have professionals who can assist them in peer-to-peer mentoring, so that they can talk to those who have already been through it.
Most importantly, I think that creating critical assessments for identifying the particular needs of individuals upon release. I think out in the communities, especially those on probation and parole, I think that identifying within that particular individual, having an individualized assessment program that is designed to, for a particular person's particular needs, is probably most critical.
If one size doesn't fit all.
Exactly. A person may have substance abuse, a person may have mental illness, but when they re-enter the community, they're treated all the same with the same level of tolerance and behavioral stipulations. If a person has substance abuse, there is requirements for a person to go get substance abuse treatment. However, a lot of it, the measures are punitive usually. I think that, and the amount of treatment and the quality of treatment, because of funding and resources, becomes a significant barrier. Housing, these sorts of things. If a person doesn't have housing, that becomes their priority. Not going to treatment, not.
I see.
And so point. This is critical. Providing a person with the basic needs to feel comfortable enough to go apply for a job, to go to a program. Without those sustained basic needs, a person really doesn't have many options. And not only that, but and this is just basic psychology, but punishment may suppress a behavior. But the behavior is not forgotten. Operant conditioning.
What does the Phoenix Association do to help ex-offenders?
The Phoenix Association, consists of men and women who are formerly incarcerated. They're socially conscious. They've transitioned really well into their communities, and we want to aid in the reforming of the criminal justice system across this country, in particular departments of corrections, but also other criminal justice agencies. And we want to do it through an honest and open dialogue with administrators and staff in those facilities and agencies. We want a better understanding with them in terms of who we are and why they can have a healthier system, a system that reduces recidivism, helps men and women, including their staff. Guards, correctional officers, should be allowed to do far more than turn a key and just house men and women. They have so much more to give. And, the good ones, I got a tremendous amount from it. Their support as well that allowed me to maintain during my imprisonment. And so they're the people that prisoners see the most during the course of the day, every day. And, so they should be allowed to give more to us. And I know some of them want to as well.
I see. Our time is up, unfortunately. You said you're a case manager. Do you work with people who were previously incarcerated?
Some of them. The majority of my work entails, I went back to school for drug and alcohol counseling and work with individuals in substance abuse. And, and the barriers are still the same. I mean, a person, whether they're coming out of rehab, whether they've destroyed all their supports through active use, or whether they've been incarcerated, I mean, the treatment looks the same.
Okay, but it must be helpful to have someone like you who understand the process to help those people who are coming out. It must be helpful to have someone who knows what it's like to help to guide them.
It is, and meeting a person where they're at,
Yes.
I think, is critical, and just being able to convey the hope that change is possible. I mean, because I think everybody has the ability to change, and I think that given the opportunity, most people will show goodness when given the chance to do that.
Well, thank you both. I am glad that you're both doing so well.
Thank you.
And I hope that you will continue to do well, and I hope that we'll be able to revisit this topic and probably talk more in a regular program about the need for what you both do and more about the Phoenix Association.